Welcome, my friend. This is Philip Mason with The Philip Mason Show. I am delighted to be with you here today. We're going to talk about education in America today, and I am excited to share with you some things that I've put together. And I hope they're helpful for you, and I hope that you enjoy them. I'm a little cold today. I got my jacket on, and I hope you're warmer than I am today. So we're going to jump right in here and just share a few things with you. So I want to talk a little bit, kind of starting from the beginning about Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson, I've got a book with all of his writings in it here. He's one of my favorites for a lot of reasons. But Thomas Jefferson had a lot of really great ideas about education in America and how it should be formed and shaped. And so what he's written is just very impactful, and it has influenced us all the way to today. And Thomas Jefferson's probably, of all the founding fathers of America, he's probably the most intellectual and probably the most intelligent of the bunch. He's certainly the most scholarly and the most diversified in his areas of study and research and experience. As far as intellectual capability, I think Alexander Hamilton's probably his equal, or maybe even in some ways a little bit better. But Thomas Jefferson's definitely head and shoulders above most of the founding fathers when it comes to academic pursuits and studying and learning. It's interesting. Thomas Jefferson just basically taught himself, which isn't entirely true. He had really great teachers and mentors too. But, when it came to law school, he essentially made this goal to become a great attorney. And so he spent 5 years studying the law, and with just tremendous courage, tremendous strength. And he just jumped in and made it happen. But he'd studied for 5 years, so there wasn't much he didn't cover in that 5 years. And so he was kind of the undisputed champion of education in America. I want to talk about Thomas Jefferson and what he wrote in his notes on the state of Virginia. And as the state was developing, his thoughts for how the state would develop and grow and mature. Particularly, I'm going to read some parts about the education system in Virginia that he envisioned and he thought would be very beneficial and helpful for the state. So this was actually put into a bill, and it was proposed for the state of Virginia. I'm just going to read a few clips, a few excerpts here from the things that Thomas Jefferson wrote. It's really fascinating. So we're going to walk through this and just kind of talk about this for a moment. So our education system today, actually, in many respects, kind of follows this pattern, but it has since been blown out of proportion. But he says this bill proposes to lay off every county into small districts of 5 or 6 miles square called hundreds, and in each of them to establish a school for teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic. Basically, he's forming school districts that he calls hundreds in 5 or 6 miles square. And then he goes on, he says, the tutor, so each of these hundreds, this geographical school district basically has a tutor assigned to it or hired for it. The tutor to be supported by the hundreds, and every person in it entitled to send their children 3 years gratis and as much longer as they please, paying for it. So the idea is to get some basic education to the children. 3 years would be free. And then from there on, if you were going to continue to be educated by the tutor, you would have to pay for it. So the idea being here is the tutor would always have some students that would continue on beyond the 3 years and would have a source of income. And it says these schools to be under a visitor who is annually to choose the boy of best genius in the school, of whose parents are too poor to give them further education, and to send him forward to one of the grammar schools, of which 20 are proposed to be erected in different parts of the country for teaching Greek, Latin, geography, and the higher branches of numerical arithmetic. So he's basically just outlining here just a system. So you have your little school districts, and then you have a tutor that would take care of those students. The first 3 years would be free, and then after that, parents would pay for their students to continue to receive more education. And then he would actually have, perhaps someone from a school board, but a visitor would go to the different area and select a student that showed a lot of promise, that was very intelligent, but their family was too poor to pay for education, and select that student to come to grammar school so they could get a more complete education. And that would be done on the public taxpayer dime. So, and it's interesting the topics that they would study and choose, which most of those aren't the topics that we do in our school systems today. So I'm going to skip down a little bit further here. He says the ultimate result of the whole scheme of education would be the teaching all the children of the state reading, writing, and common arithmetic, turning out 10 annually of superior genius well taught in Greek, Latin, geography, and the higher branches arithmetic or math, turning out 10 others annually of still superior parts, who to those branches of learning shall have added such of the sciences as their genius shall have led them to. So he's basically saying, we need a system where if students choose to advance, if they choose to learn more, that they have that opportunity. And those best students can be selected from off the top and they can go and get more education. And those that really don't care, or it's really not their cup of tea to sit in school all day, they can go do other things, but they still need that basic education. And so Thomas Jefferson saying, let's educate the masses. Everyone needs an education to a certain degree, but if their talents, their skills, or interests lie somewhere else, don't hold them in school. It's not worth it. But tick, pick the 10 best, and then we're going to pick another 10 that are even higher above that 10, and we're going to give them opportunities to expand into other subjects and topics, and that they may be able to continue their education and hopefully contribute to their state. So it's interesting. He goes on. He says. Um, Turning out 10 others annually of still superior parts, who to those branches of learning shall have added such of the sciences as their genius shall have led them to. So, you know, we're not forcing this upon them. It's not because they're good at it. It's because they have a desire for it and they have a natural talent for it. And he says, shall have added, the furnishing to the wealthier part of the people convenient schools at which their children may be educated at their own expense. So he says, we will furnish some schools that wealthier people can send their students to, but it'll be at their expense. It won't be on the taxpayer dime. But we want to make sure that there's a regular school in each geographical pocket. So this next phrase is really fascinating to what Thomas says next. So listen to this very carefully. I think this is very key. He says, the general objects of this law, so he's talking about the laws of the state of Virginia, are to provide an education adapted to the years, to the capacity, and the condition of everyone, which is absolutely amazing. We don't really do that today in many respects. And directed to their freedom and happiness. Wow, that's pretty novel. In theory, in our school system today, we do this. In practice, I don't know. It can be a question mark, and it can depend on the school, it can depend on the teacher, it can depend on what the system's doing. So education is adapted to the years, right? And adapted to the capacity. We certainly adapt to the years pretty well in our school system for the most part. But there's some challenges there. But to the capacity, so each student has different learning capacities, and the condition of everyone. So some of us may have, physical needs, mental needs that require extra care and attention, and others of us may be very self-directed and be able to learn very quickly. So there's some conditions there to take into effect, which Thomas was very well aware of. But this next part is really fascinating, where he says, directed to their freedom and happiness. Directed to their freedom and happiness. Wow. Our school system today, a lot of what we do with our students is mandatory. It's required. We force education upon our students. But Thomas Jefferson is saying quite the opposite. Our students should be self-directed according to their freedom and happiness. And we just don't do that in our public school systems today. It is a system of compulsion and requirement mandated by the law, and you get yourself in big trouble if you don't go to public school. And you're forced to learn all these topics you may not have any interest in. But Thomas Jefferson is saying education, the power of real education is when you have the freedom, the liberty to go and explore on your own, and you're pursuing your happiness by gaining your education. I'm just going to throw in a quick story here. When I used to live in Massachusetts, we had a great family friend, and he served in the Coast Guard. And we went to church with him. And in church, he actually got up and he told some of the young men, he was in charge of the ministry for the young men. And he told some of the young men, he's like, you know what? school, today's school isn't for everyone. College isn't for everyone. And, if you ever think about the armed services or the Coast Guard, come and talk to me. I'd be happy to chat. And I wasn't expecting it, but that's what he said. And I just thought, you know what? There's a lot of wisdom in that. Some of us are just well suited for certain occupations, certain sciences, certain activities, certain careers where you're out and you're physical and you're active. And it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for a lot of those people to go and get a college education. They're much happier doing something else. They have great skills and talents in other fields. It could be, the trades. It could be in the military. There's a lot of options out there. But I thought that was really fascinating, and I just reminded of that experience reading this from Thomas Jefferson. So he goes on. He says specific details were not proper for the law. Specific details were not proper for the law. So what's he saying there? So Thomas Jefferson's basically saying, don't get in the weeds on education. It's not proper. You don't have to spill out everything in minute detail. But yet, education today, that's what we're doing. We spill out things in minute detail, and we expect students to do more and more at younger and younger ages. It's really bizarre. And so Thomas Jefferson's all in favor of education should be about freedom and happiness, and the law should be very vague about what it requires, because it's mostly a private matter, is what he's saying. And he goes on, so we'll continue reading here. He says, these must be the business of the visitors entrusted with its execution. So he says, you would have these visitors would be he doesn't specify, but if you had a visitor who, worked with the schools, someone who was well educated themselves, and they could determine, they would have good judgment on how these students are learning, who are the best students, what are their fields that they really excel in, or their areas of scholarship that they really excel in, and let's select those and help them move on in the system. So it's a really step by step system that's beneficial. So it allows people to only go as far as they really need to, or as they really want to, or as far as their freedom and happiness demands of them. So it's a beautiful system. I know this is a lot, but hang with me here. So I'm going to read a little bit more. So he says, the first stage of this education being the schools of the hundreds, wherein the great mass of the people receive their instruction. The principal foundations of future order will be laid here. So the principles of future order will be laid here. So this would be like, today we would say elementary school or preschool. Like there's, this order of how education happens, and helping students be able to just develop the skills of learning is really important. And we're doing this for the masses because Thomas Jefferson really recognizes that there can be a great divide between the rich and the poor, and oftentimes that's education, and that education is what allows the rich to become rich, and the lack of education is what keeps the poor poor. And so Thomas is saying, what, in America, where we have all this freedom and happiness, we need to have some sort of mechanism in place where people can get more education regardless of their economic status. And that's been a problem throughout the ages. And it doesn't matter what society, what country, that's always been an ongoing problem. And so here we have Thomas Jefferson, the genius, in his own right, saying, you know what, we need to pull out the geniuses that are out there, regardless of their economic situation. And we need to allow them to study the fields that they need to study so that they can bless our society, so they can be fulfilled, they can be happy. And those who are content with other pursuits, with other occupations, we'll give them enough education to do that, and then give them the freedom to go and do it rather than keep holding them in the system and demanding that they get more education in other fields or in other specialties. I think there's a lot of brilliance in that. He goes on and he says, the principal foundations of future order will be laid here. Instead, therefore, of putting the Bible and Testament into the hands of the children, so he's talking about the New and Old Testament, which was very common education for Americans before and after the American Revolution, and that's really what most people had. They had their Bible, and so that's how you learned how to read, was from the Bible. But he's saying, a lot of the really heavy issues of religion and of salvation and everything at a very early age. Sometimes children have a harder time of understanding that. So he's saying, we'll help them learn some other facts first, so kind of ramp up to it. Now, I don't think he's saying that you shouldn't teach children the Bible and religion at an early age. I don't think that's what he's saying. I'm just saying for the purposes of a public school, he says, I think this will be helpful, generally speaking, for everyone. So he goes on and he says, at an age when their judgments are not sufficiently mature for religious inquiries, their memories may therefore be stored with the most useful facts from the Grecian, Roman, European, and American history. The first elements of morality, too, may be instilled into their minds, such as, when further developed, as their judgments advance in strength, may teach them how to work out their own great happiness. Man, I'm totally blown away every time I read this because it's so foreign to what we have today in our education. So here he is, he's saying that religion is important. Thomas Jefferson was a disciple of Jesus Christ and a Christian for sure. But he also recognized the need for all of these secular topics, all these temporal topics, and how important that they are. He's saying we need to teach them about ancient antiquity, about the classic, Roman and Grecian empires. We need to teach them about the European empires. We need to teach them about American history, how we got to where we're at now. And he says, on top of that, all that secular knowledge, we need to have training as to elements of morality. And so they can discern between what is right and what is wrong, the study of what is right and what is wrong. They need to have that experience here, even at the most basic level. And he says that as they advance, and they become better in their judgments, you will teach them more and more morality. As we go on here, he says, by showing them that it does not depend on the condition of life in which chance has placed them, but is always the result of a good conscience, good health, occupation, and freedom in all just pursuits. Thomas Jefferson wants to prove to everyone, and he says that education has this catalyst effect of being able to help people move into making good judgments. They can choose between right and wrong. It also helps them to develop a good occupation and then to be able to maintain and improve their health and have freedom, freedom in society to buy and sell and trade and to socialize and to worship God how they would choose. And he says in all just pursuits, anything that's just, worthy, praiseworthy. He says we want people to be able to grasp onto that, hold on to it, and execute on it. And he says we don't want people to feel like they're stuck in their situations. Education helps people realize that they're not stuck in the circumstances into which they are born, which has been the tragedy of the ages. If you read through a lot of the great works from a lot of the great authors over the centuries, over the millennia, that's a common theme. It's a very common theme. Thomas Jefferson says, we've got to reverse this. We've got to change this. America's got to be different in the way we do education. He goes on, those whom either the wealth of their parents or the adoption of the state shall destine to higher degrees of learning will go on to the grammar schools. He's basically saying, if you've been selected because of your good scholarship and your interest in these areas to go on and receive more education by the benefit of the state, then that's a wonderful, beautiful thing. Or if by the nature of your wealth, if you have the resources and you want to receive more education, you can go too and receive more education, but you're going to pay for it. Um, so Thomas Jefferson's outlining a system that would be very fair, very just system. He says, go on to the grammar schools, will constitute the next stage, there to be instructed in the languages. The learning Greek and Latin, I am told, is going into disuse in Europe. So the classic languages, Greek and Latin, he thought were very important because you can read those original texts in their original language that were so important, all the great classics from the Romans and Greeks that had so many powerful teachings in them. But I find this very fascinating, is he's saying even in Europe, which has typically been the stronghold of education for the world up until Thomas Jefferson's time, Thomas Jefferson's saying, you know what? I hear the Europeans are getting rid of these languages. They're not studying them. They're not learning them anymore. And he says their education's starting to go down the tubes. It's not real great, which I find this fascinating because Europe's decline educationally has been more advanced than ours, but we've followed suit with Europe. As theirs has deteriorated, so has ours. And we've followed their pattern. And I'm going to explain in a moment why that is. And so we have to be really careful, um, you know, this decline away from real education where you're reading the best books and you're reading the classics and you're studying the important languages and getting a foundation in reading, writing, and math and the sciences. All of that is just so critical to the success of a free nation, free country. But when we start departing from that, that's when problems start arising. So I'm going to read one more passage here, and then I'm going to go back to what we just read there and explain a little bit of the decline in education in America. So hang with me. I know this is heavy. I know this is a lot, but you can do this. He says a little bit later on, I'm jumping forward here. He says, as soon as they are of sufficient age, it is supposed that they'll be sent on from the grammar schools to the university, which constitutes our third and last stage. So first he's talking about the school of the hundreds, which is kind of your general elementary school is probably what we'd call it today. But you have a tutor, and then you have students from a little district that come together and they get tutored for free for the first 3 years. And then after that, those that want to go on can go to grammar school where they go into more depth, learn the languages, and get a really good, solid classical education. And then the third step from there is jumping on to the university system. So they can go on and get specific training in a particular area. If they want to be a minister or a pastor, they can become more trained in the scriptures and the Bible. If they want to become an attorney, they can study the law, so on and so forth. And it says, which constitutes our third and last stage, there to study those sciences which may be adapted to their views. By that part of our plan which prescribes the selection of the use of genius from among the classes of the poor, we hope to avail the state of those talents which nature has sown as liberally among the poor as the rich, but which perish without use. I'll read that one more time. We hope to avail the state of those talents which nature has sown as liberally among the poor as the rich, but which perish without use, if not sought for and cultivated. So he's saying, intelligence is among humans everywhere, right? How people get to cultivate that and develop it a lot of times depends on their material riches or their material wealth. And so he says, if we have a system where those who are maybe come from a poor family, they can have an opportunity to learn and study more and be able to develop themselves, and they can move up through these three tiers and make something of themselves. And not only that, they'll benefit their fellow citizens, they'll benefit their state, they'll come up with inventions, they'll come up with better forms of government, so on and so forth, right? They'll be able to provide for their families. There's all sorts of benefits that come from a good education. So that's a few snippets from Thomas Jefferson out of his notes for the formation of the state of Virginia. And I think these are really fascinating because they help us understand how he's thinking. Now, Thomas Jefferson, he probably wrote the most of any of the founding fathers on education. There were certainly others that wrote quite a bit too. But I think he thought about it the most, and I think he was probably the most proactive in saying, hey, we need to do something for the masses as far as education goes. Thomas Jefferson was our man in that regard. Now, what's interesting is as we move forward into history, as the United States becomes more developed, there's another politician that comes on the scene. I mean, his name is Horace Mann, and you may have heard of Horace Mann. So he lived from 1796 to 1859. He was basically what we call an educational reformer. He was a U.S. congressman. He was the Massachusetts Board of Education from 1837 to 1848. And he later served as a college president as well. So very influential individual. But Horace Mann's is interesting because he actually went over to Europe and to study how the Europeans did their education. Now, Thomas Jefferson, much earlier, was saying, European education is kind of going down the tubes. Now, that doesn't mean all of it was going down the tubes. A lot of Americans in the 1800s went over to Europe. There was a huge groups of people that spent very large amounts of time over in Europe becoming educated. And it was mostly wealthy Americans that were doing it. They were the ones that really could do it. But a lot of wealthy Americans, that's what you did if you wanted to get more learning in medicine, or if you want to get more learning in the law or in the arts, you would travel over to Europe to study with the masters. Now, that didn't mean that doesn't mean that everything was healthy over in Europe, and there was a decline in a lot of things. And if you read some of the European philosophers, they point this out too. It's not a secret. But I think it's so fascinating that at such an early time, Thomas Jefferson was even saying, you know what, I'm noticing education in Europe is in decline. They're not even teaching Greek and Latin anymore like they used to. Their grammar schools are going downhill. Horace Mann, he goes over to Europe, studies what they do, and he's like, oh, I like this new way of doing education. And so he brings it back over to America. I think Horace Mann and Thomas Jefferson, I think they're interesting. They would agree on certain fundamental things, such as, education for the masses and giving opportunity to everyone. But when it comes to other things on how that education should be executed, Thomas Jefferson wanted to have a very system focused on freedom and happiness and progressive steps that would allow the students to pick the level that best suits them. Whereas Horace Mann, he wanted to get away from that. He wanted to standardize everything, and he wanted really to make things non-sectarian, which there's certainly some advantages to that. I think we can all agree to that. But he basically took the Bible out of public schools, out of the school systems. And all today, in today's world, everyone would say, yeah, of course, take the Bible out. But what we have to remember is the Bible was the foundation of American education in the 1700s, even the 1600s, of course, 1600s and 1700s, and into the 1800s. And so when you took the Bible out of the public schools, you kind of also taken morality out of the public schools. And that's what Horace Mann did. And that's his legacy. And so unfortunately, one of the reasons why education is declining in America is you've seen the decline in morality. Thomas Jefferson, just like I read, he was really big on, even in the youngest ages, let's start teaching them morality. They have to get that along with the secular topics, with their grammar school topics. They have to be able to get that morality in there. And that's one of the challenges we have with our modern education system today is we've taken morality out of it. Like it doesn't exist anymore. And what we do have is this very artificial, very shallow form of morality where there's no depth or meat to it at all. So Horace Mann, he's the father of our modern education system. So he's the one that kind of took things from what Thomas Jefferson envisioned, the founding fathers envisioned, and he crafted it into kind of this modern state education system where everything's standardized. And he really criticized a lot of the school materials that were being used at the time. Now, granted, a lot of times people didn't have a lot of materials. They didn't have a lot of books. And so he had a valid point here. There needed to be more books and certainly more books than just the Bible, right? Even though that Bible was core and essential to um, American beliefs, American theology, American government, so on and so forth. It was just foundational. American morality, it was so foundational. It was a national book, and it's what built America. But Horace Mann was kind of that pivot point where we started changing things here in America. So I want to talk about this transition for a moment and just one aspect of it. I could spend a ton of time on this, but I just want to share with you a few books. I've got a collection of books around me, and books and education are so important. And I know we're in the age of AI, and I'm all in favor of AI. And AI is a powerful learning tool, and you can go and learn anything on it. And so it's beautiful because just like Thomas Jefferson and even Horace Mann, leveling that playing field and that anyone can get an education, AI is really leveling that playing field like never before. But I still firmly believe that you need the best books. You need to read those best books, and AI can't read those for you. And you're not going to become the person that you need to become by just getting facts and knowledge off of AI. You need to develop understanding, you need to develop wisdom, and that can only be done by reading the best books, hands down. If you want to become well educated, if you want to be powerful in your wisdom and in your judgment, in your understanding, you have to read the greatest books in the world. You have to read them, and you have to make a serious study of them. And AI can't do that for you. It can give you a lot of great information on it, but if you just have facts in your head, you're not going to get the full picture, and you're not going to get that experience of having to fight it out to work it out and to get through these great classics and to understand the stories that are in there and to be able to internalize them in detail and in brilliance. You really have to do that by reading and studying on your own. There's no substitute for that. I'm going to share just a few books with you. So, in Thomas Jefferson's time, you would read the classics. You would literally read an author's books, right? So for example, I've got a few classics here, and this is just a random selection. I'm not trying to say anything about the ones I've picked, but like, a classic, this all come from different time frames, but for younger children, Wind in the Willows is a classic. It teaches morality. It teaches some really good lessons. It's a great, great book. Another classic, we call this a twisted classic, but Machiavelli's The Prince teaches some really powerful lessons and is a warning. It's really a warning to all of us who love freedom that princes and principalities can not always be the best thing. And then, I have authors like C.S. Lewis, The Great Divorce, or other writings. He's an intellectual giant of the 19th century. His works have become classic in nature. Like William Shakespeare, Much Ado About Nothing, or any of his plays. They're all beautiful and powerful. Or his sonnets. Moliere, the French version of Shakespeare, his plays are brilliant. Tartuffe, very humorous, some French humor. Those are all great classics. Sophocles, some of the things he's written, just very powerful stories that have lasted through time. Those are just those are just a few samples there of some classics. Oh, different times and ages have their classics. We can have modern classics, but these are the great books. They teach timeless principles and they teach great values, but they teach morality. They help us to judge between right and wrong. That part of our education is irreplaceable. You can have someone who is a very talented mathematician or scientist, but if they don't have any morality training, those are the people that you hear about on the news who are being investigated by the Justice Department or being arraigned before a judge because they slip up and they do something that they shouldn't have done. And unfortunately, that's the way it is. And so you need to have both sides. You need to have the sciences. You also need to have the arts. You need to have the liberal arts. You need to read the classics, and they have to go together. And you have to do both of them. You're a dual being. You're a brain, but you're also a heart. So you need to educate your mind, but you also need to educate your heart. And both of those facets of our human being are very critical, important to our success and in our education. And so that's really the dilemma that we face. If we go from a Thomas Jefferson level education where we're reading the great classics down to Horace Mann, what Horace Mann did is he actually came up with this concept of textbooks. So a textbook is where you grab snippets of all different books in different fields of learning and you compile them all into one book. Now, textbooks in a lot of ways are a good innovation, right? They're very efficient. You can get a lot of information really quickly. It's cheap. It's cost effective. If you're running a school system, you can get a lot of books for a lot of students and they can get a lot of different information real fast, right? Seems to make sense, right? The challenge is textbooks are a slippery slope, and over time, they can devolve instead of evolving. Sometimes they evolve. They should evolve. As more knowledge is gained, they get added to, which is a benefit of a textbook, is you can get a broad swath of a subject or a topic. You can also get depth if a textbook's really good at giving you depth from a lot of different authors, and so it helps with that. It can speed up your education per se. So textbooks can have a lot of benefits for sure, and a lot of my education has been through textbooks. I went through public school systems, and my bachelor's degree when I was doing that, pretty much the bulk of it was textbooks. I spent a lot of time reading textbooks, but I realized that something was missing from my education, and I realized that something was lacking. And what it was, I just wasn't reading the full works of these great authors, these great writers. And regardless of what field it is, it could be in any field. It could be math or science. It could be in the arts. It could be in literature. It could be in philosophy. It could be in the languages, whatever it is. Read the best authors in those fields and read their original works. There's just no replacement for that. There's just not. Okay, so I'm going to share a few more books with you. So I've got some really old books here. So this is an old textbook. This one is about 90, 95 years old. Um, it's called The Magic Garden. Um, but it has pictures. These are for younger children, and it's got stories in it. And they give you little snippets. But the interesting thing is I look through these books, they teach morality. They teach right and wrong. And it's a reminder that these books came from a different era in American history because a lot of the morality that we have today does not fit in these textbooks anymore. It's outside of these textbooks. And the cardinal virtues, all of the great virtues are taught in these books, just very beautifully. So I'm going to share another one here. This one is Reading and Living, book one. So this is the first in a series of a textbook. Heel and Lyman is the authors on it, but just has some literature in it for reading. That's kind of interesting. There's a poem right here in the front, and it says, "Making homes. Better than gold is a peaceful home where all the fireside characters come, the shrine of love, the heaven of life, hallowed by mother, sister, or wife. However humble the home may be, or tried with sorrow by heaven's decree, the blessings that never were bought or sold, and center there are better than gold." Abram Joseph Ryan. So, right out of the gate in this book, it's talking about the importance of the home and of families and of mothers and of sisters and brothers. You won't ever find anything like this in a modern textbook. And if you do, it's been specially curated that way, and you're probably in a special charter school or private school. But you wouldn't find something like this in a modern public school. And there's even this beautiful little picture in here of the Cratchit family from Charles Dickens with Tiny Tim and their Christmas goose. I guess she's pulling out the plum pudding. So there's this picture of Mrs. Cratchit with the plum pudding. I don't know if you can see that or not, but the morality in here is just really powerful. But it's a textbook, and it's a sampler. It's a textbook sampler for using in, grammar school. And this one, this book is from 1924, printed in the United States of America, 1924. So this was printed during the Roaring Twenties, right here. Textbook. Still had morality in it in the Roaring Twenties. And the Roaring Twenties were known for producing a lot of wickedness. But yet, the majority of Americans were being taught morality in the school system. Even though Horace Mann had already started the process of removing it out of the school system, it was still there for the majority of Americans. It was more advanced in states like Massachusetts versus, we'll say, Missouri or Nebraska, right? Okay, so there's that book. Here's another one. This one's the Natural Method Readers, a fifth reader. So basically, we'd say like a fifth grade reader today. This is a very old book. It's starting to fall apart here. But once again, the stories in here are just inspiring. They're uplifting. And like, here's this picture of George Washington talking to these two young children. It's talking about a story with George Washington, and they're painting George Washington as a hero. And in today's literature, everyone's questioning George Washington. And, the great man of integrity that built America. Everyone's questioning his integrity. And, a lot of people even, spit on the face of George Washington today and say he's an awful man, for whatever reason they have. They list off many of them. And, they forget that he's the man that built the country that gave freedom and liberty and happiness to all, even if it took time for that to occur for everyone. He established the rules and the laws and fought the battle that made that happen. So we can't forget that. And this textbook doesn't forget that. And this textbook, it's old. Copyright 1918. So it's very old. It's falling apart here. Some of the pages are becoming dust. But it's an American textbook from 1918. And it holds the founding fathers up as heroes who did the right thing and who wanted everyone to be happy and have freedom and who wanted people to be honest and have integrity. The textbooks are just so different from back then compared to today. Here's another one. And some of these books are actually from my great uncle, Roy Perry. And so this one actually has his name in the front of it and the school that he went to, Brigham Young Academy in Utah. But this one's physical geography. It's a geography book. And this one's old too. It's over, about 125 years old. And some of the information in here is a little antiquated, but most of it's dead on accurate and still relevant today. But just a very beautiful, charming little book, but old. Here's another one. This is the oldest one I have here. So this is a Webster's dictionary, Webster's Handy Dictionary, and it's illustrated. It's meant for children in school. But children in school actually had dictionaries back then in those days, and it seems like we don't use dictionaries in schools anymore. We don't look up words. We don't know what their meanings are anymore. And this book is the pages are almost literally going to dust, and the binding and the glue on it's going to dust. But you can see it's kind of deteriorating, and it's beautifully embossed. It's got beautiful embossment on it. But this book is from 1864. There's the copyright on it. So, and my uncle's got he's written his name on there a few times, Roy Perry. So, Webster's International Dictionary, kind of, you can see there's a few illustrations in it, but a beautiful little book. I really, I love dictionaries. I think it's so important for us to understand the words that we use and know their meanings, and we just don't do that in our education today. Here's another one. So, this is a math book, Hamilton's Essentials Arithmetic. First book. So it's your first level math book. So there's problems in it, there's explanations, there's story problems. Um, there's practice, there's oral and written work. They're learning fractions in here, division, all of your math, your arithmetic, and another beautiful little book, little textbook. Certainly a lot different than the ones you'll find today on math. So the little jaunt through history there with some of our textbooks. So the point I want to make here is that textbooks were efficient and they allowed the masses to gain more education. So I think that's a really good thing. I wouldn't dispute that at all. The challenge is that textbooks today have gotten further and further away from morality and from the original sources and from the original authors and the original thinkers, the original scientists. And so a lot of times students are very far disconnected from the reality of those great thinkers and those great scientists and the great ideas that they had. And it's just presented to them as plain boring information. And a lot of students just kill over when they read it or they see it in the textbook. So I'm going to give you a couple examples here of modern textbooks, some of them which are pretty good and pretty helpful, but we've come a long ways. So this is actually a college level textbook. This is Geographical Information Systems, and it just goes through a very systematic approach to laying out information. And you can see the pictures, and then the author just basically tells you what you need to know. He doesn't bother telling you about who came up with that idea and why they came with it. There's some pretty good graphics in this book, which can be helpful. And so, textbooks can serve a really great purpose, right? But they're limited in their scope and their ability to inspire the human mind and to inspire the human heart and to teach morality. And sometimes that's not the purpose of the textbook, obviously, right? With GIS, the purpose is to help train people use technology and satellites to be able to map out the Earth and to make decisions off of those maps, right? This one's an American Heritage reader, and it basically has a sample of a lot of different writings from American history. So that's a little bit of a jaunt through history there, from older to newer. I found one more here that's sitting here on my desk. I've got more, but this one's kind of interesting. This one's from the 1930s, and it's called The Elements of Business Training. We're starting to see the rise of business books um, in schools, and this is a higher level class. Once again, this is my uncle's book. It talks about making payments and writing checks, how to run a bank ledger, things like that. It's just fascinating, and talking about different types of ownership. Anyways, we're much more sophisticated in our business knowledge today, but really, there's a whole section here on banking. But I think one of the things that we miss out on in today's society is that none of us read the ancient books anymore. None of us read the classic books. None of us read the modern classics, the great books of our nation anymore. And it's really kind of sad. I just want to share a few stats here. This comes from my mentor, Oliver DeMille. He wrote this great book called The U.S. Constitution and 196 Indispensable Principles of Freedom. Just a fantastic book. I highly recommend it. It's one of my favorite books. But he looked at a few statistics and he shares a few here. I'll just give a few snippets here. So the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, they completed a national survey to determine the civic literacy of Americans, specifically the impact of college education on one's civic literacy. The survey asked basic questions about American history, government, and principles of freedom and tested a random sample of 2,508 American adults. So he's quoting from this study here. He says, after all the time, effort, and money spent on college, students emerged no better off in understanding the fundamental features of American self government. 71% of Americans fail the test. Fewer than half of all Americans can name all three branches of government, a minimum requirement for understanding America's constitutional system. The study also found that office holders typically have less civic knowledge than the general public. I think most of us watching the news can probably figure that out. Unfortunately, that's not true of all, but there's a big portion of them that are that way. On average, they score 44%, 5 percentage points lower than non office holders. Note that this study used the most basic questions about our freedom, so these weren't complex questions. So John W. Whitehead noted, when Newsweek asked 1,000 adult U.S. citizens to take America's official citizenship test, 29% of respondents couldn't name the current vice president of the United States, which that's pretty weak. 73% couldn't correctly say why America fought the Cold War, and more critically, 44% were unable to define the Bill of Rights. It is little wonder that a survey by McCormick Tribune Freedom Museum found that fewer than 1% of adults who responded to a national poll could identify the 5 rights protected by the First Amendment: freedom of religion, speech, the press, assembly, and the right to petition the government. But it gets worse. Many who responded to the survey had a strange conception of the First Amendment. For example, this totally gets me. 21% said the right to own a pet was listed. Some, 17%, said that the First Amendment contained the right to drive a car. And 38% believed that taking the Fifth was part of the First Amendment. Kind of hilarious, huh? All right. So, and then it goes on. It says, indeed, 76% of college graduates weren't familiar with the Bill of Rights, and 73% couldn't name the enemy of the United States in the Cold War. There are many similar statistics, he goes on. But I love this kind of summary that he gives us here. This is, once again, this is from Oliver DeMille, one of the great scholars of the U.S. Constitution, and someone who loves the classics and has studied the classics most of his life. He says, our modern citizen, or we could say our modern educational student out of our public school system, has lost something vitally important: a clear understanding of the complex and even the simple details of freedom. As Neil Postman reminded us, regular farmers, workers, and other normal citizens in the 1787 to 1789 timeframe clearly understood the deep and complex details of the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist Papers. And citizens during the Lincoln-Douglas debates sat for 6 to 12 hours listening to in-depth technical discussions of freedom structures. So just think about that for a moment. That's pretty mind-blowing. We've devolved in our ability to be wise. We've devolved in our ability to be educated as a people. We haven't educated our minds very well, and we certainly have neglected to educate our hearts. And so it's pretty incriminating. We're in a bad spot as a nation. And it can be easily remedied by going and reading the best books, the great books, by original authors, by the best thinkers in the world. But these are some of the results, some of the statistics of what happens when we have a public school system that relies just on textbooks, and the textbooks can be manipulated and changed by anyone, especially people who don't have an interest in the success and well-being of America, or who don't believe in the history of America and believe that America should become something else. And so we have to be really careful, because if we have an uneducated populace, then we won't know what's in our U.S. Constitution. We won't know what's in our Bill of Rights. And when that happens, when you have a people who don't know what their rights are, guess what? That's prime ground for a tyrant to come in and to take things over. guaranteed every time. Plato, the great philosopher Plato, one of the things that he pointed out through the mouth of Socrates in his work, The Republic, is that democracy, ruled by the people, where the people make the laws, it's actually just one step away from hell. It's actually one step away from tyranny. When a society has gone to a pure democracy, they're on their way to having a tyrant rule over them. Just like Napoleon ruled over France when France couldn't get their French Revolution right, and the people started taking things over and started conducting themselves in immoral ways and just became a bloodfest. And so it was prime ground for a tyrant to come in and claim that he was doing the best thing for the masses, which Napoleon really wasn't. He was in it for himself, and he caused a lot of war and destruction and a lot of pain for a lot of people, which is very unfortunate. And here in America, the last thing we need is an American Napoleon. We don't need an American Napoleon. We have a perfect form of government. Let me back up. It's not a perfect form of government. We have perfect principles, and we have a very good government structure. And so we have to remember that, and we have to trust in it. And there's the Constitution can be amended, but we have to make sure that we make wise amendments to it for the betterment of everyone. And we aren't going to know what those amendments should be unless we've read the Federalist or Anti-Federalist papers, and we've really made a concerted effort to really understand all the issues and to understand the principles that make for a free society. So this is a powerful topic, and I'm so glad that we've had an opportunity to discuss this today. I know that there's no replacement for a good education, and I have total confidence and trust in you that you can take the time to be educated, that you can take the time to read the great books. I know that you're smart. I know that you're intelligent. I know that you can understand the great works. Alexander Hamilton's a great example. I talked about him earlier. I mean, absolute genius in the way that he formed the Federalist Papers, along with John Jay and also with James Madison, just some incredible thinkers. We should study those work. We should know the issues. We should know the principles that make for great forms of government. Okay, so that's a little bit about textbooks and the development of history over time, from Thomas Jefferson, Horace Mann, to kind of our modern times. And I think we have great times ahead of us. I'm excited for AI. I think it's going to help us understand and know the classics even better, and to understand the great commentary on the classics as well. And I think the AI can be very powerful in helping us to gain knowledge, and the classics can be very powerful in helping us to gain understanding and wisdom so that we can be a moral people. And I think with both of those together, we'll be unstoppable. My friend, thank you so much for taking time to be with me today. I've enjoyed our conversation on wisdom and on education and on the great books. Thank you for being here with me today, and we'll catch you on the next episode.